In 1905, after having painted outdoors on a hot sunny day, the French painter Maurice de Vlaminck took a break at a bistro in Argenteuil, a suburb of Paris. While there, he noticed 3 sculptures on a shelf, 2 vibrant West African pieces from the Yoruba people from Dahomey, and a darker one from the Ivory Coast. Captivated by the work, he persuaded the owner to exchange them for buying everyone in the house a drink. Later, he shared these pieces with a friend of his father's, who then gifted him 3 more African carvings, including this mask from the Fang people of Central Africa. Shortly thereafter, at his home, a fellow painter, André Derain, saw the mask hanging over his bed. Vlaminck later wrote that Derain was speechless and stunned and offered him 20 francs for it. Derain took the mask to his studio, where it was later shared with the artist Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso, who were also reportedly greatly affected by it. Vlaminck showed another African sculpture to Derain, remarking that it was almost as beautiful as the Greek marble sculpture Venus de Milo. Derain then replied it was as beautiful as the Venus. Then they showed the sculpture to Picasso, who outdid them both by declaring that it was even more beautiful. Later, the French dealer Ambroise Vollard then borrowed it and had it cast in bronze by Aristide Maillot's bronzesmith. The revolution of 20th century art was underway. During the early 20th century, the aesthetics of traditional African sculpture became a powerful influence among European artists who formed an avant-garde in the development of modern art. While these artists knew nothing of the original meaning and function of the West and Central African sculptures they encountered, they instantly recognized the spiritual aspect of the composition and unique stylizations and adapted these qualities to their own efforts to move beyond the naturalism that had defined Western art since the Renaissance. For much of the 20th century, this interest in non-Western cultures was often described by art historians as primitivism, a term that is now seen as problematic because of its implications of Western superiority. However, many modernist artists of this era admired these works precisely because they embodied different and unique styles and standards. Starting in the 1870s, Europe saw an influx of thousands of African sculptures following colonial conquests and exploratory missions. Initially viewed merely as artifacts from colonized cultures, these objects held little economic value, often ending up in pawn shop windows and flea markets. However, visionary avant-garde artists like Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso, along with their contemporaries in the School of Paris, were among the first Europeans to recognize and appreciate the aesthetic value of African sculptures. From 1900 to around 1940, Paris emerged as a vibrant center of artistic innovation, facilitating unparalleled opportunities for the exchange and collaboration of creative ideas. The period leading up to this moment had witnessed a rapid expansion of European and American anthropological and ethnographic museums, making African artworks more accessible to both artists and the public. For example, in 1882, the Trocadero Ethnography Museum, now the Quai Branly Museum, opened its doors to the public in Paris. The Permanent Museum of the Colonies, now called the National Museum of the Arts of Africa and Oceania, and the African Museum in Marseille also showcased a diverse collection of objects from the colonial territories, such as tools, weapons, baskets, headdresses, etc. By 1886, Berlin's Museum of Ethnology displayed nearly 10,000 African objects. Even France's Universal Exhibitions, or World's Fair, which focused on industrial progress, began including African and oceanic products after 1851. By the turn of the 20th century, major non-Western collections were exhibited across various museums in Liverpool, Glasgow, Edinburgh, London, Hamburg, Stuttgart, Vienna, Berlin, Munich, Leiden, Copenhagen, and Chicago. These collections came about because countries were aggressively expanding their empires in the 19th and 20th centuries. Western powers set up colonies to access raw materials, expand markets for their products, and acquire new territories. For instance, the United States, France, and Holland maintained colonial outposts in the Pacific, while Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Spain, and Portugal divided up Africa. These colonial cultures were often seen as primitive, leading to the labeling of non-Western artifacts in museums as artificial curiosities or fetish objects. These were discussed as the curiosities of a culture the West didn't understand. The term fetish object or fetish figure originated from Portuguese sailors who encountered West African cultures in the 16th and 17th centuries, describing their religious practices as worshiping inanimate objects and animals. Today, fetishism refers to the belief in material objects possessing inherent power. However, this term often carries condescending undertones, associating it with magical beliefs and superstitions. It suggests a hierarchy of human progress, with Westerners deemed more advanced than Africans. Christian traders and missionaries of the time viewed African culture as alien, blending the religious and material realms that Europeans considered separate. Displaying these objects collected from colonial expeditions served to reinforce the perceived need of maintaining colonial control. Colonialism often carried a missionary dimension, with these artifacts depicting strange gods or creatures, reinforcing the belief that indigenous peoples were barbarians in need of civilizing or saving. This perception not only justified colonial rule, but also supported missionary efforts worldwide. It's not clear if avant-garde artists understood the imperialistic implications of adopting non-Western culture. Nonetheless, many artists appreciated the vitality and freshness of non-Western images and forms. These different cultural influences offered Western artists new ways of looking at their own art. One of the most influential artists of the 20th century, Pablo Picasso, was deeply influenced by African art. In the spring of 1907, the French artist Henri Matisse was on his way to visit the American writer and collector Gertrude Stein in her Paris home when he stopped in what used to be referred to as a curio shop to purchase a small African sculpture. Picasso, who was also visiting Stein when Matisse arrived, was immediately captivated by the sculpture that was later identified as an Nkisi statue from the Vili tribe in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Picasso, who was known to be extremely superstitious, believed in the magical and transformative power of objects. According to Max Jacob, French poet and lifelong friend of Picasso, the Spaniard clutched the small sculpture in his hands all night, inspired by its elongated features, streamlined forms, and spiritual purpose. The encounter ignited something profound in the 25-year-old Picasso, who had recently come out of his blue and rose periods and was earnestly searching for a source of inspiration that would catapult him to the forefront of the avant-garde. After discovering the Vili sculpture, the artist visited the Trocadero Museum in Paris beginning in June 1907 with fellow artist and friend André Derain, where he encountered a rich collection of masks and sculptures. This was a pivotal turning point in the artistic trajectory of Picasso, who famously described to curators and critics of his revulsion at the dimly lit, musty galleries, but also his inability to turn away from his study of the object's inventive and elegant figural composition. The African sculptures, he said, had helped him to understand his purpose as a painter, which was not to entertain with decorative images, but to mediate between perceived reality and the creativity of the human mind, to be freed or exorcised from fear of the unknown by giving form to it. He stated, quote, "I have felt my strongest artistic emotions when suddenly confronted with the sublime beauty of sculptures executed by the anonymous artists of Africa. These works of religious, passionate, and rigorous logical art are the most powerful and most beautiful things the human imagination has ever produced. I hasten to add that nevertheless, I detest exoticism," end quote. While the difficult and mercurial Picasso acknowledged the initial impact African art had on his vision as an artist, he later notoriously denied that his work was inspired by it, stating, quote, "African art? Never heard of it," end quote. Picasso was no anthropologist. He did not understand how African works functioned in their original cultural context, yet his encounter with African art was clearly very profound. At the time of his death in 1973, Picasso owned more than 100 African figures, masks, and musical instruments. To Picasso, African masks were magic things, and he sought to capture their power in his work. Inspired by the creative abstractions, exaggerated proportions, and power of African art, along with the structural experiments of Paul Cézanne, Picasso co-founded, with George Braque, a radical new art movement, Cubism, which took its name from Matisse dismissively commenting that Braque's work seemed to be nothing but a bunch of little cubes. Cubism is very important to the development of modern art because it challenged the traditional systems of representation by dramatically rejecting the 500-year-old Renaissance system of linear perspective. By challenging the notion of depicting objects from a single viewpoint and instead present them from multiple perspectives simultaneously, it shattered the illusion of depth and forced viewers to engage with art in a new, more complex way. Completed in 1907 and considered the genesis of modern art, the painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon contained the direct creative expressions of African masks in an aggressive, large, 8-foot square painting of 5 women in a brothel. In preparation for this work, Picasso created more than 100 sketches and preliminary paintings. Here, Picasso wrestled with the problem of depicting 3-dimensional forms in a 2-dimensional picture plane by merging figure with ground. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon marked a radical break from the realism that had defined Western art since the Renaissance, drastically challenging the notions of what art was supposed to look like. The faces of the 2 central figures were inspired by Picasso's fascination with the ancient Stoic busts from his Iberian heritage. The figure on the left is represented in the Egyptian style, while the woman in the top right corner bears resemblance to the highly stylized masks of the Dan tribe from the Ivory Coast. These sacred masks, revered for protection and as a way to communicate with spirits, can be distinguished by their high foreheads, pointed chins, and pouting mouths. In the lower right, Picasso depicted a flattened face of a woman with a curved, swooping, triangular-shaped nose, mirroring the geometric style of the Mbuya mask from the Pende people, which are used in ceremonies to mark the end of circumcision rituals, millet planting celebrations, and the ritual of enthronement of a chief. Picasso didn't publicly exhibit Les Demoiselles d'Avignon till 1916, and many of his peers that had previously seen the work in his studio thought it was distasteful. Offending the Paris art scene of his day, this work was met with almost unanimous shock, distaste, and outrage. George Braque, who would later work with and develop Cubism with Picasso, was fascinated, but disturbed when he first viewed the work, and told Picasso, quote, "You may give all the explanations you like, but your painting makes one feel as if you were trying to make us eat cotton waste and wash it down with kerosene," end quote. The Fauvist, André Derain, commented that, quote, "One day we shall find Pablo has hanged himself behind his great canvas," end quote. Even Henri Matisse thought Picasso was ridiculing the modern movement and making a bad joke. Matisse had called the painting's figures hideous whores for its rejection of the traditional idea that art should copy nature or that artists should adopt the traditional techniques of perspective, modeling, and foreshortening. Cubism was indeed revolutionary and shocking by the standards of the day. These artists cared about representing what they knew rather than what they saw. By emphasizing the 2-dimensionality of the canvas, deconstructing and fracturing objects into geometric forms and reorganizing them, this radical art would later pave the way for abstraction by encouraging artists to think more critically about perception and the nature of reality. Picasso's impact on the development of Cubism and Modernism is unquestionable. However, it's essential to recognize the profound influence of African artisans on his work. Picasso's radical use of 2-dimensional forms, fierce geometry, and flat planes owes a great debt to the so-called primitive art of Africa. An art which seemed to embody a directness, closeness to nature, and honesty that appealed to modernist artists determined to reject conventional models. African art has played a crucial role as a revitalizing and energizing force in Western art.